Hi everyone! Today I'm going to be showing you how I did the embroidery on the tomato tee. For the embroidery, what you're going to need is a tapestry needle, some scissors, and the yarn that you want to use for the embroidery. I ran out of the green yarn that I used for this, so today for the tutorial I'll just be using this gray scrap yarn. For this tutorial, I'll just be turning this around and we'll show you the embroidery on this side of the tomato just because I don't have another sample to show you on. Just as a disclaimer, I really don't know much about embroidery. This is really just how I figured out how to do it while I was designing the pattern, so I'm definitely not an expert by any means, but I still wanted to put this together because I thought it might be helpful. The first thing that you'll need to do before starting is to cut a length of your yarn. The exact length of it doesn't need to be anything super precise, but I would err on the side of longer rather than shorter just so that you don't accidentally run out of yarn while you're in the middle of doing the design. Next, you're just going to thread your yarn onto your tapestry needle. Now that I have my yarn threaded, I can get started on doing the design. The first section that I will be working on is the stem. So I want the stem to start a little bit off center in the tomato and then create this curved shape, as you can see right here. So I'm just going to rotate my work so that I can show you on the other side. To do the design, I will mostly be using the chain stitch technique. And to create that off-center look, I'm going to be starting my chain in the third stitch from the right, so this stitch right here. To do the chain stitch, you're going to start by inserting your tapestry needle from the back of the work to the front of the work through the stitch. You'll go from the wrong side of your work and insert the needle through the stitch to the front. Once you have your needle coming through to the front, you can pull your yarn, but don't pull it all the way through. You're going to want to leave yourself a bit of a tail on the back. So I'm going to be leaving this tail here. You want to make sure you're leaving yourself a pretty generous tail. This will just make it a lot easier to secure your work and weave in your ends later on. For now, I'll just hold this tail in place with my left hand, but later on I will secure it with a knot before weaving in my ends. Now that I've brought my yarn and my needle through to the front of my work, the next step is to insert your needle from the front of your work to the back of your work through that same stitch that you came up from. So I will just insert my needle here. Instead of pulling your needle all the way back down, the next thing that you'll do is bring the tip of your needle back up through the next place that you want your stitch to go. The direction of each individual chain stitch will sort of follow the angle of your needle at this stage. So because I brought the tip of my needle up right here, my stitch is going to angle in this direction. The last thing you need to do before pulling your needle through your work is to take the yarn, and it's not the end that's threaded through your needle, it's the other end. Take your yarn and wrap it around the needle, and then once it's wrapped, you can pull your yarn through. One thing you want to be careful with when you're pulling your yarn is to make sure you don't pull it too tight. If you pull your stitches too tight, it can sometimes warp the fabric around it. Just play around with it and find the tension that you think works best for your individual project. As you can see, once you finish the stitch, it creates this loop that sits on the surface of your work, and then you have your working yarn coming up through the center of this loop. In order to do your next stitch, you're going to follow basically the exact same set of steps. The only difference here is that before inserting your tapestry needle through your fabric to the back side of your work, you're going to first insert it through the loop that you just created. First, I'm going to insert my needle through the loop. Then I'm going to insert it from the front of my work to the back of my work through that same place where my yarn is coming up. And then lastly, I'm going to bring the tip of my needle back up through to the front of my work. And then I'm just going to wrap the yarn from left to right around my needle and then pull everything through. So now I have 2 stitches done. I'm going to do 3 more to create my stem, but you can do however many you like for what you think looks best with the particular yarn that you're using. I just finished doing the stitches for the stem of my tomato, so now I'll show you how to finish off a chain of embroidery so that it stays secure and stays in place. In order to secure your chain of stitches, after you've completed your last stitch, you're going to take your tapestry needle. Instead of going back through this loop, I'm going to go around it and insert my needle down to the back of my work and then pull that through. So you can see here that the yarn is sort of coming over the top of this loop, and then on the back side, you have it coming through to the back of your work on your needle. And this prevents those stitches from coming unraveled. If you were to insert it back through the loop and pull, all of the stitches would come undone. So now that I have that chain of stitches finished, I'm just going to secure this end with a knot, and then I will cut my yarn and weave in my ends later on. For the next part of this tutorial, I will show you how I did this section of the embroidery. I'm just going to refer to them as leaves. I don't think they're technically leaves, but that's just what we're going to call them today. In order to create these, what I did was I did one chain of stitches going in one direction, and then I rotated my work and did the same number of stitches going in the other direction. And so that creates this sort of pointed shape. I want the leaves to come out from the base of the stem, so I will do my first stitch in the same place that I began my stem embroidery down here. I'm just going to turn my work back around and I will show you how I do that part. Like I said, I'm going to be starting this in the same stitch that I started the base of my stem. So I'm just going to do this stitch following the exact same steps that I did for the stem, and I'll just do about 3 or 4 stitches going this way, and then I'll show you how I turn the work around and do it in the other direction. Now that I've done my first row of stitches, I am basically going to rotate my piece and then do the stitches in the other direction. Even though I'm turning around, I can still insert my needle into the same last stitch here, but then I will just bring my needle up going this way as opposed to going that way. Now I'm just going to do 2 more stitches going that way so that I finish in the same place that I started. Now I've finished the first leaf of my tomato. One thing to note is that if you used a mohair or a lighter gauge yarn for the red portion, just make sure you're being particularly careful not to pull your stitches too tight, because it will be more noticeable on this lighter yarn if your stitches are warping at all. Now I'm just going to repeat the same process and create the other 3 leaves around the base of my tomato stem. I like to make them a little bit irregular, so I'll do them in slightly different sizes, and you want to make sure they're kind of all going out in different directions. I just finished adding the rest of the embroidery on here so you can see what that looks like. If you had any gaps, sometimes I end up with gaps in here. You can just use some more yarn and stitch back and forth in here. This one actually turned out okay, so I don't think I really have any gaps to fill in. Once you're done, you can take all of your ends on the back and just secure those with some knots and then weave those in. One thing I would recommend is to do your best when you're weaving in your ends to weave them in behind the embroidery as much as possible, just to prevent the contrasting color from showing through to the front of your work. That's it. That's how you do the embroidery on the tomato tea pattern. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this helpful, and don't forget to like and subscribe.